Let me just start off by saying it's a great pleasure for me to be at Stanford. Both the location and the fact that I'm with you at the Graduate School of Business is a tremendous privilege. As you'll have heard from Dean Joss, I was never an MBA myself, but to come to an MBA environment and business school, any educational environment is a tremendous privilege. I have to say I envy you guys. I think this is just the most extraordinary campus, and it's really a great privilege to me to be here. I would also just like to say, if I may, particularly if there are any faculty in the room, and Dean, on behalf of you and your predecessors, I would, on behalf of McKinsey, like to say thank you to Stanford. Stanford has been an unbelievable source of talent and leadership for McKinsey over many, many years. Many have left McKinsey. They're in other leadership positions. But if I could say to all of you on behalf of your predecessors, a big thank you from McKinsey. It's just been a wonderful, wonderful privilege for us. Now, what I thought I'd like to do, just with those few words of background, is that there are two themes that I thought I'd like to talk to you about, particularly as this is sponsored by the GMP and the Graduate School of Business. I'd like to give you a sense of what, at least in my view, is on the minds of CEOs across the world. Not just in the US, not just in Europe, but this will include Japan, China, Southeast Asia, Brazil, Chile. One of the great curses of my life, but one of the great joys of my life, is I get to travel a lot. And I do get to meet a lot of CEOs. I don't know them always very well. Some are sitting in this room today. But I do get a sense of what's on their mind. And I talk to my colleagues a lot, who work with CEOs. Now, I just wanted to give you an idea of what the global themes that I think are on the minds of CEOs, and I think will be on their minds the next 3 or 4 years, independent of the unknowns that are going to happen. So give you a sense, if you look at the global context, what's on the mind of CEOs. And then, if I may, very, very briefly, just what I think it's going to mean for leadership skills going forward. And I think it's going to be different from what it has been in the last 10 years. And I hope that some of that will resonate with you, whatever you choose to do, whether you choose to go into business, public sector, banking, hedge funds, consulting. I hope some of those themes will resonate with you. I'll speak for about 20, 25 minutes, that's okay, and then throw it open for questions. And so if there's anything you want to pursue with me specifically, leave it to the questions. Now, before I do that, I was told that for some extraordinary reason, you'd like to know a little bit about me, apart from the glowing testimonial that Dean Joss gave in my love of cricket. So I will just spend a little bit of time talking about myself, not just because I like talking about myself, but partly I think it'll give you a sense about how I think about things. I also think it's very important whenever you hear anyone giving a point of view, what they think, where are they coming from? It's not a question we ask often enough. Where are you coming from? What's your background? What's your nationality? What's your experience? We're all of us victims of our own prejudice. So if I'll give you a little bit of a sense of my own prejudices so that you can put what I say into context. Now, as Dean said, I joined McKinsey when I was 28 years old. I'd worked in business. I had no MBA. I have to say that when I joined McKinsey, I did not know what DCF stood for. That was quite unusual, even in those days. If anything, McKinsey was even more technically minded. It was an experiment, and for the first 2 years of my life at McKinsey, I was told a bad experiment in recruiting non-MBAs. So I joined straight. I had no thoughts of being a consultant. I'd always thought my career would be either in business or in academics. By a series of flukes, and I think fluke and circumstance plays a large part in any of us lives. It certainly did with me. I joined McKinsey at 28. I frankly struggled the first 2 years. I always enjoyed it because I was learning so much. I was getting an MBA experience in 2 years as well as meeting some fabulous people. But gradually got the hang of it, decided this was the sort of environment that I liked. Not all my friends at the time did, but it suited me, partly because I'd worked in business and I was able to make a comparison. And I stayed through. I worked mostly in the consumer product sector. I led the consumer practice in McKinsey for 8 years. Well, we didn't have one. I started it. Actually, that's packaged goods and retail. Those are the industries I know well. I led that practice. I then led our marketing practice, and then I led the London office of McKinsey before, for reasons that I cannot possibly explain to you. My colleagues elected me managing director 2 years ago. Now, some of you will ask me, or have asked me already, what's it like being the CEO of McKinsey? And the answer is, A, I'm not a CEO. I am not a CEO. It is a professional partnership. Most of the people who have talked to you or will talk to you actually run companies. McKinsey is not a company, and I most certainly do not run it. It's a partnership. We have 290 directors, senior partners, and 600 junior partners, principals. So there are 900 people who own the company. They're the shareholders. But the ethos, at least of McKinsey, like most professional service firms, is an independent professional partnership. So if you ask me how many people report to me, the honest answer would be one, my assistant. Another answer would be 940. Another answer would be 290. So it's a very, very odd structure, partnership structure. I think sometimes try to be as being like a herder of cats. And so I'm not sure that I can, sort of give you a sort of what's it like being a CEO. I have a lot of authority, which I can use or abuse, and Lenny will tell me I do a bit of both sometimes. I have very little power. I have very little power indeed, which is unlike many, many CEOs. I happen to believe that I think a leadership characteristic in many organizations is moving from power towards authority, but in a partnership you depend solely on personal credibility and influence, and people saying, yeah, that sounds reasonable, we've got to get things done. So it's a different type of structure. It's around leading people. I won't go on too long, but I think it's a different type of role from most CEOs. The second point is, as Dean Joss mentioned, I've been elected, not appointed. So to an extent, it's a peer type role. And I have to recognize that. It's much more like a political process in that sense. It's an election rather than an appointment. So having acknowledged that what I do is sort of rather different from the normal CEOs or the normal leaders that you will see, nevertheless, I think what I have to deal with are very similar to people who actually run organizations, whether they're in the public sector, the not-for-profit space, or in companies. And let me just give you the four things that I focus on, which I think, having watched CEOs, is what practically all CEOs or leaders of academic institutions or leaders of civil service departments also have to worry about. So my point is, although what I am is very different, actually what I have to do through a different form is quite similar. Number one, setting the culture. In my case, reaffirming the culture. I think all leaders of organizations, whatever they are, have to think first and foremost about setting the culture that they want for their organization. Number two, identifying, appointing, and building the leadership team. Again, I think this is a generic skill that you have to do. How do you appoint and develop the leadership team? Although people don't report to me, I do have the power of appointment. Who runs the West Coast practice? Who runs our private equity practice? Who's going to oversee recruiting? Who's going to drive our initiative to improve the retention of women in McKinsey, for example? All of these I have power of appointment. So those appointments and building the team is something I have to do. Again, I think very similar to what most CEOs have to do. Number three, telling the story. I think Steve Ballmer has spoken to you. He talked about being the cheerleader. Pick your language. I know exactly what he means. Telling the story. In McKinsey's case, it's mostly internal. One of the things I thank God for is that I don't have to deal with investors and analysts. I just do not have to deal with them. Our investors and analysts are my colleagues. Sometimes that can be even tougher. You can get tougher questioning, but I know them. And I can look everyone in the face I know individually. So that's telling the story about what you're trying to do, what the firm is trying to do, talking to new recruits, talking to people leaving the firm, talking to the partners, talking to clients. Telling the story is what I call it, being the cheerleader, is number three. And then the final one is defining the priorities, defining the themes that are going to shape my time as the managing director. This, if it was in corporate speak, it would be the strategic agenda. And there's lots of different words that you can use. I use the word themes. What are the themes that we're going to focus on? So the tasks that I actually spend my time on are setting, in my case, reaffirming the culture, appointing and building the leadership team, telling the story, and then just defining the priorities. Very quickly, for those of you that might be interested in McKinsey as an institution, I won't spend much time talking about McKinsey, don't panic. For those of you who are not at all interested in it, just what are the themes that I have chosen? I'd just like to give a flavour. Another individual would have picked 3 different themes. This wasn't mandated, it's what I've chosen. But just to give you a flavour. Theme number 1, there are 3. I think coping with more than 3 or 4 themes, many CEOs have 8 or 9 themes. I personally think that's too many. I think 1 is great, 2 is good, and 3 is okay. I've got 3, and I can't quite get it down to 2. I'm still working on it. Theme number 1 is redefining what McKinsey means by problem solving. We've always defined ourselves, and our clients as people who define problems, help clients identify opportunities, help them deal with challenges and issues. And traditionally, I think it's fair to say that we have had a similar approach to problem solving that is usually embedded in business schools. Very analytical, very, very focused on structured thinking, very focused on discipline, very focused on process. And that's great. I think it's important. My belief, and I think many of my colleagues' belief, is that that is no longer enough. And that we have to spend much more attention on the softer or the people sides of problem solving. Why do people do what they do? Why do companies make the decisions that they do? What's going on in people's lives which will affect how motivated they are to do the rational thing? We all know, and you all have read, and believe me, it's true, 50% of decisions that are made are not rationally rational. So why do they go on happening? And there's practically always a good reason. And practically always a good reason is somebody on two legs, or people on two legs. So theme number one is how can we incorporate a deeper understanding of what motivates behavior, good and bad. Some of the things that motivate decisions may not be very good, but spending a lot more time understanding that side alongside our traditional analytical and process skills is something I feel very, very passionately about. I don't think it's a redefinition of what we do. It's about problem solving, but it's bringing this aspect into what we do, which means we have to change our behaviors, how much time we spend with clients, how human we are as people. The language I use for that is IQ, CQ, RQ. IQ, you'll understand, that's intelligence, insight, ideas. Traditionally, what firms like us, are associated with. CQ is what I call capability and competence. This is where McKinsey has been investing very heavily for the last 5 years. Deep marketing knowledge, deep corporate finance knowledge, deep IT knowledge, deep understanding of how processes work, really understanding how offshoring works, just to pick some examples. These are competencies. In my view, the days of pure generalist management and pure generalist consulting are over. It's both specialized knowledge and integrative. I think we spotted that quite some time ago. That we have to continue. And the final Q is RQ. It's what I call relational quotient. And I don't mean just getting on with people, being nice and being able to drink a couple of gin and tonics with people. I don't mean that. I mean understanding how people relate to you, to each other, to their company, and to decisions. So it's a part of the company ethos, our client's ethos. So that's theme number one, IQ, CQ, RQ, trying to redefine and broaden the definition of problem solving. I believe if we can do that, I think it'll lead to better outcomes for our clients and I think more motivation and satisfaction for our people. Theme number two is Asia. Asia. You'll have heard that before. This is not the most staggering insight in the world. Everybody knows it's important, but knowing it's important and making it happen is something different. McKinsey's been in Asia for a long time. We opened up in China in 1993, long before any other professional services firm, and we huffed and puffed and we struggled and hit our head against a brick wall. For example, we've been in India for a long time, we've been in Japan for a long time, but we really are doubling down. Just an example on that, we've had 16 partners move to Shanghai in the last 15 months. So really, really getting serious about Asia. I don't need to tell you why we're doing that. You know better than I do. But really, really getting serious about that. And I'll come on to this. It actually has a lot of challenges for culture, how you think about things and how you do things. You all know about GDP moving eastwards, all that stuff. You all know about China and India. It's going to have far, far bigger implications in the way organizations are run, in my view, than anybody's yet realized. The final theme on my agenda, before I go on to talk about the purpose of this talk, is innovation. Innovation. McKinsey is quite good at talking to clients about their need to innovate. We haven't always, being frank with you, been quite as good at ourselves. We are really looking at challenging our orthodoxies of the way we do things. Two particular areas I'd pick on. One is our people, how we serve clients, how we deal with people. You will have heard from talking about the people about the consulting lifestyle, how we work, how we deal with clients. We're going to really, really tackle that head on. And a lot of that is innovating in the way we work, using technology, using flexibility. If any profession could and should be flexible, it's consulting. People can come in and out. We know it's very difficult for a law firm or a taxation department or people at offshore engineering to be flexible. We can be. And so making flexibility really work is something we're going to do. Making diversity a reality. Everybody talks about McKinsey being the benchmark of a diverse, culturally diverse organization. I wish that were true. I wish that were true. Yes, we have every nationality in the world. Yes, we have a lot of women that work for us, but that is not my definition of diversity. Most of our people have MBAs. Most have engineering and quantitative backgrounds. Most would fit into this room within a nanosecond. I think diversity is diversity of personality, diversity of academic background, and we are actively looking to recruit, for example, people from liberal arts backgrounds, from medical backgrounds. We even recruited somebody recently who was a priest. And I want to push that. I think it's very, very, very good. Maybe it's the Dalai Lama, actually. Making it up, right? That's why I'm here, so to do that. So diversity to me is a lot more than women in different races. I think it goes culturally. I think it goes the way people think. People's academic backgrounds has a huge influence on the way we think. We're really, really pushing that very hard. Second point of innovation, and I'll shut up, is knowledge. We are a knowledge institution. We're probably more like an academic institution than we are like a business. We invest hugely in knowledge development. We're often cited as a role model for knowledge development. If that is true, God help everybody else. That's all I can say. And we are really, really looking at that very seriously. One thing that we have not yet responded to, and we had the most fascinating lecture from a professor of psychology, is how the internet and how teenagers learn and communicate with each other. I don't know if you watch how people blog and exchange information. We're looking to apply that to the knowledge base so that you build knowledge through interaction, preferably personal, but through technology. These sorts of technique of knowledge exchange we're really working on, and we invest massively here. I just want to give you a flavour of that. And then finally, we're going to get a bit more sassy about the way we deal with clients. And we have a very, very methodical, very disciplined, extremely professional approach. We're going to experiment with new ways of the way we work with clients, how we communicate with them, how we relate to them, how we use different problem-solving approaches. So just to give you just one person, in my case, Managing Director McKinsey, view of the themes that I have. When you hear other CEOs, I'm sure they talked about themes. It's about redefining problem-solving, broadening it, really doubling down on Asia, and focusing on innovation, particularly on the way we handle our people and particularly in terms of knowledge development. Now, that's just a little bit of a long introduction, but I hope it gives you a sense of sort of where I come from, the things that I worry about. Now, let me just move briefly on to the main core of what I wanted to say to you, which is what's on the mind of global CEOs, and what do I think will be on the mind of global CEOs. There are 5 themes. I'm not going to spend much time on them. I'm just going to list them. If any of them intrigue you, perhaps you can expand on them in the questions. Theme number 1, strategy is back. Strategy is back. Now, strategy, I've always thought, is a cyclical thing. I think most themes in business are cyclical. 3 years ago, strategy was dead. Who needs strategy? It's a waste of time. You can't predict anything. There was a lot of nonsense going on about strategy 3 years ago. There's a lot of nonsense going on about strategy now, about it's all about strategy again. That's not true either. All I'm saying is there is a time for strategy and there's a time for implementation. There's a time for growth. There's a time for cost cutting. There's a time in the cycle of companies and industries. Now is the time, and I think it's going to go on, unless there's a real economic crash, for really rethinking about strategy, and specifically the basics of strategy of where and how to operate, not compete. I'll come on to that, how to operate. What's driving that? Every country I go into the world, virtually every CEO I talk to, the 2 themes that they are worried about is growth, not margin, not cost, it's growth, but this time related to that is risk. How much risk are they prepared to take in order to grow, and how do they deal with the financial community? And these virtually everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're in Japan or in China or in a family business in Southeast Asia or in Brazil, that keeps coming through. There's a lot of empirical evidence that says growth is the ultimate determinant, not just of value, but also of survival. There's a lot of pressure on companies to grow. And it's this growth-risk trade-off which I think is absolutely the nexus. CEOs are more thoughtful, in my view, than much of the financial community, and certainly than the media and the public on the risk side of it. Profitability is extremely high at the moment. In my view, the systemic risk in the system in some of these companies have been grossly underestimated, but the CEOs sort of know that, and they don't want to do about it. Most of them do not want to go to the investors and say, yes, I know we're doing very well, but really it's much riskier than you think. You just don't do that and watch your sound price. But they do worry about it a lot. And the other thing that's linked to it, which I think is not talked to much, and I think has gone outside the academic agenda as well, is time frames. over what time frame do you think about growth and strategy? And there's a definite cultural and intellectual clash going on here. The cultural trend is towards short-termism. The intellectual trend, when you look at investment, I think is towards more of a long-term look. And there isn't any good theory at the moment for thinking about time frames for strategy. I think I'm right in saying about 3 or 4 years ago that there was quite a lot about pacing. I don't know, there was a lot of interest, and then it all sort of died. I hope someday, some of the academics will pick up this issue of time frames. How sustainable a strategy is a very, very important part of the value of a company. And that's something that CEOs are really wrestling with, particularly when you go to Asia, where they do take a very, very long-term view. So theme number 1 is, if I call it the strategic agenda of this interplay between growth, risk, and time frames. And there's a lot of muddled thinking going on between the two. Theme number 2, yawn now. This is deeply boring, but it's important. It's globalization, Mark 29. In my view, we're still at the very early stages of globalization. In my view, we're just beginning to see some of the management implications of what globalization is actually meaning for companies. The reality is, for most firms, particularly American firms, is that globalization is going to new markets in Asia. That's going global. No, it's not. It's exporting. And increasingly going global on the supply side, offshoring, outsourcing, call it what you want. What's happening now is we're moving beyond that to actually redefining organizations in a global context. What is called offshoring, which I think is a complete misnomer about what's going on in the supply chain, I'll just leave that, is beginning to affect how organizations actually operate. I'll tell you a story. I was talking to the CEO of one of the big semiconductor manufacturers, world leader, and he said, look, I've got a big problem. He said, I need a new CFO of one of my divisions, and I've got 2 candidates. One is in the US, gets paid $750,000 a year, plus, and you know plus in the States normally means 3 times that. And the other candidate is in India, and he gets paid $40,000. And I think the Indian person is better. What do I do? Easy, you promote the best one. But think about it. So if I promote the Indian, and then what do I pay him? $3 million or $60,000? If I pay him $3 million, what does that say to the organization, of whom there are 3,000 in India? If I don't, how can I say you're a member of the top management team? What do I do? So we're beginning to see that, and this is going to happen. This is now finance. It's going to happen in HR. It's going to happen in marketing, production. This is a company that had 60% of its sales were global, but the culture and the history of the company was 100% American. And they're going to confront very, very fundamental issues, in this case, compensation and team. There was one person on his board, and it was a token person who was non-American. We're going to see some massive challenges coming out, some of them so big that I think you'll see some companies being forced to withdraw from being as international as they'd like because they can't cope with it organizationally. Massive, massive issue. So let me just say, globalization, don't just think of it in terms of markets and supply chains. That's obvious. Everyone's got that. Offshoring, it's the second and like everything in management, it's the second and third order consequences where things get really interesting. And this is going to get very, very interesting. Third point, deeply obvious, but again, apologies for raising it. It is absolutely crucial, is technology. Technology is an enduring issue, again, like globalization, particularly E and on the internet. Everything that was promised on the internet in 1997 turned out to be true. The only people who got really burned were the financial community. Everything else in terms of impact on business, in terms of organizations, turned out to be true. It is absolutely fundamentally transforming the way business is done. Again, I'm sure you've been told this often, but when you see what I do and see, it really is. Transformation means something. When you see what it's doing, it is fundamental. And the biggest impact, which again has not yet been seen, is what it does to human behaviors. At the moment, it's transformed processes and it's transformed distribution possibilities through channels. But the human dimension is only now just being understood. You're seeing organizations with very strong cultures unwinding because of their dependence on technology. They're doing incredibly well, some of them, because they're dependent on technologies, but their cultures are unwinding because the human glue has been replaced by technology. This matters if you want to be an enduring organization. So that's theme number 3, a fresh look at technology, which goes way beyond the usual approaches, using it to optimize processes, second, third order consequences. Again, a lot of it comes back to organization. Fourth one, capabilities. This is particularly the hot theme in Asia. It is not, to talk to this group about capabilities is unfair. You do not represent the world. Please remember that. You do not represent the world. You represent a very, very, very small and privileged part of the world. Capabilities, not just talent, not just intellect, but deep knowledge, whether it's about marketing, about finance, is a massive problem, particularly in very fast-growing economies like India and China, also in Russia, Central and Eastern Europe. Also, I would suggest in the States as well. There is a huge capability deficiency. People often talk about the biggest stumbling block to growth in China is resources and environmental pressures. It's not. Every CEO I talk to there says we are short of management, particularly general management, particularly commercial management, particularly financial and marketing people. It's people. There's going to be a tremendous, tremendous focus on capabilities. It's a wonderful time for you to be in the talent pool at the moment. And I think this is at the beginning, not at the end, particularly when you look at the Asian economies. And by capabilities, I don't mean just very bright people. That's the talent side. It's no good being great at tennis if you should be playing cricket. So this is about getting the right capabilities in the right place and time. And many companies have very skewed capabilities. I've mentioned China. I think it's true in many technology companies in the US have great technical capabilities, very weak marketing skills. In China, they have tremendous engineering talent. The output of PhDs in China is greater than that of the US and Europe put together every year. Just to give you an example, they're not short of engineers, but they are short of people. So this is matching the capabilities that you need with the strategies of your organization. And it only means something when you get very micro about what skills and what talents. And there's a massive problem building up there. The final one, which I'll finish on before I conclude by talking about what does it mean going forward to leadership, is an issue that I've written about, and I'll try not to witter on about, is particularly for very large, successful companies, what's the nature of their relationship with the societies in which they operate? This is sometimes called, much to my fury, corporate social responsibility. You know what I'm talking about. But the relationship of successful companies to the societies in which they operate. And this is particularly, this is societies as citizens, societies as governments, societies as regulators. What is the role? How do they interface with them? How do they influence them? How they influenced by them is a massive, massive issue. And it's not just a Western NGO thing. This is a big issue, and I think it's going to become a huge issue in Japan, in China, and in India as well. It's a massive business problem, this. It's a massive business opportunity as well. So I would just say that's another theme that I hear. It is not just a creature of the liberal left press in the West. So if I could pick up 5 themes that I think, certainly the last 4, and I think the first one will endure, it is this notion of the interface between growth, risk, and time frames, and all the tools, technical, analytical, as well as judgmental, that help you shape that, and how you communicate that to your employees and investors. Really thinking through the second and third order consequences of globalization beyond supply chain economics and customers, going much deeper into the organizational space. Really thinking through the second, third, fourth order consequences of technology, particularly internet, not only the internet. Fourthly, getting very precise about capabilities. It's not just talented people. It's very, very precise about the capabilities you need. And then finally, particularly for large firms, wherever they be, the relationship of these large firms to the societies in which they operate. I think those, if I've interpreted right, based on my conversation, are 5 shaping themes. I haven't talked about marketing, operations, pricing, organizational design. These are what I call the usual suspects. If you can't be competitive on cost, if you can't market properly, if you can't get your customers sorted out, game's over. Doesn't matter where you are. You have to get those right. I just don't want to talk about them. I don't think they're going to differentiate. Those are what I call platform tickets. You have to get those right. Interesting, 20 years ago, people said if you get those right, you have a competitive advantage. We've moved on from that. That's the ticket to play. Now, just in conclusion, if this is right, one person's view, you've heard my background and prejudice, if what I said is right, what does it mean? What types of leadership are likely, leadership skills are likely to be needed going forward, irrespective of the country or the geography, or in my view, the industry you come from. Obviously, there's going to be differences. Firstly, I think we are seeing, and we're going to see a lot more of a move from what I call hard types of skills towards what is traditionally called softer types of skills. Analysis, strategy, engineering, technology are crucial, but I think they have to be interspersed with people who understand how teams work, how organizations work, how people are motivated. If, as I believe to be the case, the 1980s was the decade of strategy, the money was made through strategy. You remember Michael Porter, Competitive Advantage, it was great stuff, and that was where the big bucks were made. 1990s was technology. That's where the really big bucks are made, people who got early on technology. I believe the next 15 years it's people who get the productivity equation right through people, I think, are going to differentiate themselves. And I call that hard to soft. It's really hard and soft. You've got to be rigorous, you've got to be different. But I think this human dimension, people productivity, I call it, and particularly as we move to a knowledge economy where the greatest assets are people, blah, 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 all the stuff you hear, thinking through what that really means is absolutely going to be crucial. The types of skills you recruit, the types of people you recruit. I also think it's a reason why, if we can make it possible, why women, I think, are going to be very successful in the next 10 or 15 years, because they, I hate to generalize, can often naturally relate to that. People who naturally think in those ways, I think, will become more and more valuable resources. I think global culture and mindset is going to be crucial. It's an obvious point to say, but if you believe what I said about globalization, it's not just enough to spend 2 or 3 years in different countries. The number of people, particularly Americans, not only Americans, who've been 2 or 3 years, for 20 years, but still don't have a global mindset, is staggering. People who really understand how different countries work, how different people work, I think is going to be crucial, so that nationality doesn't become a source of even comment. That, to me, would be the ultimate definition of a winning company. So having a true global culture, go back to my story about the CFO, a culture that you can naturally deal with that, you can accommodate that. People can move from Malaysia or Sri Lanka to a head office in Chicago. It takes 1 day before they're productive. That's what has to be the mindset. Huge challenge. Challenge number 3, I think it's particularly true for CEOs, but I think it's going to be increasingly true for all managers with a global company, is what I call the need for diplomacy. I stole this word off John Brown at BP. He used it. It's a wonderful idea and a wonderful concept. By diplomacy, the ability to influence events, to persuade people while always being respected and trusted yourself. I think that's going to become a crucial skill internally and externally. Trust is going to become a massively important word. Power, status, hierarchy, big banana, I think these are going to be, I hope they are, dead words in 10, 15 years' time. I call that diplomacy. I stole the word. I think it's a wonderful word. And then the final point I'll leave on is the need to be flexible. Flexible. I think both as personalities and organizations. I talked a little bit about it for McKinsey. I think organizations are going to have to be very flexible in the way they offer careers to their employees, particularly if, as I believe, women are going to be more active, but increasingly for men. And we're seeing, and I'm sure everybody else is, this demand for a much different set of opportunities in the way you live life and work. I think that's going to be true for everyone. I think being very flexible, being very accommodating, adjusting careers to the individual rather than at the moment, whatever anybody says, individuals to the careers. Most will say, yeah, I feel terrible, but that's the way we do things here. A number of times I heard that. I think it's going to have to change. What does it need for you to make it work? What does it need for you to make this work? We believe in you. So I think this idea of flexibility, individual and institutional, is going to become absolutely crucial, which runs against the career trends of the last 50 years. So if I could just pick out the implications of those trends about hard to soft, a true global culture and mindset, the importance of diplomacy as a skill, and I would urge you to study history around diplomacy to see what that, I think history is the best way to learn that particular skill, and the importance of flexibility, both personal and institutional, I think will be defining skills over the next 10 years. I probably talked longer than I should have done already. I will stop there on that particular note. I hope I've given you at least my sense of, based on tours and discussions with CEOs and colleagues and partners of mine, about what's on the mind of CEOs across the world, and at least one person's interpretation of what that might mean for new leadership skills going forward. Thank you.